Welcome to Design Downtime, the podcast where we celebrate the joys of living a balanced, creative life. I'm your host, Guy Siegel, a design director in Toronto, Canada, and I invite you to join me on this journey as we redefine what it means to be a successful design professional. Let's break free from the shackles of hustle culture and embrace the full spectrum of human experience, because life is too precious to be spent only in pursuit of productivity. Today, I have the pleasure of talking with Chris Strahl. Chris is the CEO and co-founder of Knapsack and the host of the Design Systems podcast. Knapsack helps the world's leading enterprises go from design to code quickly and accurately using design systems. A respected speaker, he has shared his visionary perspective on the use of generative design and AI technology and next-generation design systems at organizations like Google, Meta, Dribble, Clarity, and other pioneering companies. Outside of work, you can find Chris in the Pacific Northwest on a river, climbing a trail, or dreaming up new worlds for his latest tabletop game. Chris started tabletop gaming with friends in his teenage years, and he used to be a professional game master in Portland, Oregon, where he lives today. While being a CEO takes up a lot of time, he still holds a weekly game with his friends and spends time organizing games for friends and family. Chris, welcome to the show.
Hey, Guy. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here. It's funny, your intro, it cracks me up. Breaking free of the chains of hustle culture. I feel very chained to hustle culture right now, but luckily I still have at least some creative outlet that I try to make time for.
And we're going to talk about that today because you want to talk about Dungeons and Dragons.
That's right. You know, from hobby to something that has ended up defining a lot of my adult friendships, which has been pretty cool.
That's awesome. So I usually like to start these sessions with the origin story. Where does D&D come in for you?
So I remember like when I was in middle school, I think, you know, and to date myself, like this would have been the early 90s. I remember getting the Star Wars RPG and playing that with a friend and, you know, completely messing up the rules and not really caring that much about it. But it was kind of fun to just, you know, as a preteen, like experiment around with a buddy and play pretend with one another in a Star Wars universe, which was super cool. We were all really into that stuff at the time. And it was like me and my buddy Joey, we would play the Star Wars RPG and then we would also like build Legos and, you know, fly ships around our room and stuff like that. So I was always a little bit like nerdy when it came to that sort of stuff. And then in college was the first time I really visited like true D&D, like Wizards of the Coast style D&D. And it was right at the transition to 3rd edition. And it was also right when EverQuest came out. And of course, everybody's playing EverQuest. People call it like Evercrack and everything like that. You know, one of the first like big successful MMOs. And I'm sure the Ultima Online people that are listening to this are cringing when I say that. But, you know, EverQuest really brought like MMO into the mainstream. And because I played EverQuest, my buddy was like, yo, you should come and join us for a session. And so it was with a couple other folks in college, and I liked it. I enjoyed myself. I played 2 or 3 more times. And then, you know, as the story of every gaming group ever, the DM quit in shame, and we had nobody else to run our sessions. And so lo and behold, the new guy became the DM. And I'm definitely like a forever DM. And DM stands for Dungeon Master. It's the person that's sort of like creating the fictional fantasy world that everybody's working within. And it was really interesting to have like that responsibility kind of thrust on me in still my early days of learning how all that stuff worked.
How did you get the courage to step from player to DM?
I mean, I've always been a bit of a risk taker. I think that my personality just kind of reflects that. But I was also excited, and this is like funny, it's relating itself to design systems all of a sudden. I was really excited by the mechanics of gameplay. And so like reading rule books, I'm one of those like weirdos that really likes to understand how a system functions. Like when I would buy a new video game as a kid, the first thing I would do would be like comb through the instruction manual to understand how all the different things worked associated with it. Likewise, I'm like that still. I'm the guy that always is the one that reads the board game rules before family board game night. And so I got really obsessed with the rule sets. And then, of course, there were all sorts of like budding technology tools that as a poor college student, I could figure out ways of acquiring off the internet and then using to run my games. And so I had this sort of obsession with the meta, I guess. And that obsession with the meta made it easier, I think, for me to explore the creative limits of the system.
So before you became a DM, what character did you play?
Let's see, original D&D, I think I started with Barbarian, and then we went back and played a bunch of second edition modules. And I was also like really into Baldur's Gate, the video game as well, which was awesome. And like Baldur's Gate 3 now is really incredible, and it's so cool to see the evolution from like this game I played way back in like late high school to where things are at now. And I mean, a giant hat tip to Larian for making that like fun to play on a game console. But I played as a Barbarian, and then in second edition, I played a wizard. A barbarian's a great intro character because it's uncomplicated, but you can still do interesting things with it and still like really deeply participate pretty much every turn. Whereas somebody that's like a wizard is significantly more complicated, but not every turn are you doing something necessarily incredible or interesting.
Back then, what sort of DM were you? How close did you stick to the rules?
I mean, does a bad one, does that does that count? I mean, I don't know, like everybody, I went through the initial stumbling blocks, I think, of trying to figure out how to build narrative storytelling, right? I think that collective storytelling is a lot like improv. And, when you take an improv class, the whole, idea of yes and mentality and the idea of like how you build on one another, I don't think that we're innately inborn with that as people necessarily. And so narrative storytelling was really difficult. I think that, the mechanics were never my problem. I was always pretty good at the mechanics side of things. The thing that was also difficult was player balance. That was really challenging. So how do you take a bunch of people who have never played before, that are interested, excited about it, and balance them with new players that are essentially power gamers, that know all the rules, that know how to exploit the system? And so those were probably the two biggest early lessons, is like, look, this isn't about my story. This is about our story. And then the second side of it is like everybody needs to feel like they're a part of that story, no matter how experienced they are playing the game.
So how did you create that sense of we're all in this together? This is our shared story.
Well, I mean, I really didn't when I started. Like I was trying to tell a narrative, right? I was trying to like write a story and basically have people participate in my novel. And it doesn't work like that. And like, there's probably some parallel to being a CEO there, right? Like this idea that like, hey, you have this vision for this thing, and you and everybody else have to sort of like collectively tell it. But I think that like collective storytelling is really challenging because you don't know where the story is going to go, and you have to cede a lot of control of that creative process to other people. And really good DMs, which I don't know, I think I'm okay at it nowadays, they try to elicit that storytelling out of others, and you draw people into the story by giving them a moment in the spotlight, by ceding your stage time to somebody else that's in the room so they can do something truly like epic and memorable. And you also try to like play both to the character that they have and to the person that's sitting around the table, understanding that like most people, fantasy role-playing is all about putting yourself into another character's shoes. When you put yourself into that other character's shoes, you're inheriting lots of things about that character and that persona, right? A barbarian may want to smash something instead of like intricately figure out a puzzle. But you're still also playing to that person that's still sitting at the table. And you, Guy, are going to have a different idea of how a barbarian should play versus like one of the guys I play with normally. And also trying to make sure that I'm keeping into account both characters, giving you opportunities to role play in the place you're comfortable and the place you're excited to participate in that storytelling.
So your first campaign as a DM, what was the story you were creating? Do you remember?
So the first one that I was doing that was beyond like a one-shot module that you would pull out of a book, the first like custom world, it was all about these people that were basically Ghostbusters. They were ghost hunting around this really dark and mysterious world based on Ravenloft. If you're not familiar with the game system, Ravenloft, it is like it takes place in a Dracula vampire sort of setting, like very gothic and ominous. And so it was all about this idea about how these people would go and uncover ghosts. And ultimately, the end of the story was supposed to be about how they were actually ghosts themselves trying to find their doubles, basically, in the real world. And it was before that movie with Bruce Willis, Sixth Sense, came out. So I like to say that Sixth Sense stole my idea. But this whole notion of going around and trying to find out this sort of whodunit style mystery. And I mean, it didn't really work out that well. Like it had some moments that were exciting, but it's one of those campaigns that like we got about halfway through it and we shelved it and moved on to something else.
At what point did you realize that no matter how much you planned for a session, your players are always going to surprise you?
There was this one moment where there was some big epic battle I had that had been planned, where it was this monstrous spider that was going to crawl out of this trap door in the ground and start attacking the party members. And there was somebody that was a sorcerer in the group, and they did like a fear spell, which is a fairly high level spell that like blasted this big cone of fear and caused the spider to run away back down its trap door. And the spell lasts for like several minutes. And so it kind of like killed the momentum of the entire encounter, because this giant thing that was supposed to come up and be this huge fight that I had all these like really intricate plans for, all just kind of fell apart. And like how I solved as a DM is I was like, an even bigger spider comes through a hole in the ceiling. But that's not really good storytelling, right? That's just an end run around the way your characters are choosing to play the game.
How did you grow as a DM from there?
Oh, a lot of it's time, right? You get this idea of what works and what doesn't, and you keep notes in your head and notes from your players. And you also like read a lot. I think like there's been a couple of big things, right? So first, like everybody, I think that does any sort of tabletop role-playing game, I had some bad experiences with some toxic play. That was a really good lesson, like what not to do, especially as it related to like gender dynamics and stuff like that around a table where like not everybody felt comfortable with the topics that were being discussed and the things that were being played. And it's also like a very pervasive thing, even to this day. You'd think in a world where like we'd become a little bit more progressive and a little bit more aware as a society of the pressures that get placed on people and the triggers that they have about trauma and distress. I mean, role-playing games are somewhat innately violent anyway. I mean, part of the whole like rule book is how you go out and slay the dragon, right? And hopefully don't get eaten up or cooked or killed along the way. And so it's an innately this like ominous, dangerous, threatening environment. But there's also like things that people aren't particularly cool with. In particular, things like violence towards children or sexual violence, violence towards animals, all these things that represent these really dark topics. And it's shocking still to me how often it goes there. And so like that's a really good indication of what not to do. And so I got to watch that firsthand. And then I think the second side of it was like the advent of social media exploded the understanding of gameplay. And then for the first time ever, people were really able to share a lot about how their own campaigns were working. And it became less about like what rule book you read and what thing that Wizards of the Coast charges you, $30 to $50 for to go run with your friends, and more about like what is the creative effort that you can go through. And building on that, the experience of using other game systems. So being locked into a single system tends to make your world pretty myopic about, rolling a D20. So a 20-sided die in D&D is like the quintessential thing you roll. But going and playing something like Blades in the Dark, where it's a very different system, teaches you a lot about how to run all systems. And I would say the last thing was being able to do my first like for pay public play, where I was being paid as a professional DM to come in and run sessions. And we did this as a collective. So there was a group of us called Orcs in Portland that did all this together. We started it as a pop-up restaurant, which was eminently successful, and then ultimately ended up running a bunch of corporate events. We did stuff for a bunch of different agencies. We did stuff for Airbnb, a couple other big corporate events that we did in the Portland area. And that was really exciting to be able to go and do that in a setting where the players around the table were not people you knew. And it was a different style of play that was really interesting. And you had to tell a very punchy, very engaging thing in 3 hours, because that's the entire time that people are going to sit there.
So how do you create a session that's going to last 3 hours, has to accommodate people who've never maybe even don't even know what a role-playing game is, and also, again, take into account any sort of unexpected reaction they may have there?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it's a lot of learning about how to do storytelling. And storytelling is what this comes down to as a creative art, right? And I mentioned that collective role play, right? But you still need to have a narrative that you hold. And so what's the minimum amount of thing that you can write is what I always come back to in this, right? Is you want to have a plot, and pretty much every storytelling plot has some introduction, rising tension, climax, and then the payoff. And all of that sort of narrative flow, like there's a reason why that works for humans, right? Is because you have your adventure before and your adventure after, and you see that growth along the way through some tension in the middle. And so that tension and conflict is really essential. And so normally when I'm preparing for something like that, like what I write is I write an intro that sets a stage. And then I think about like, what are 4 or 5 different activities that represent something that builds tension? And then what is that climactic moment? And that climactic moment is the one thing that I'm willing to always railroad people into, is because it's your focal point, your inflection, your everything of your story is that climactic moment. And so what's that climactic moment going to be? And always try to guide your players to that, even if it's a circuitous or not exactly the route you had hoped. And then in that climactic moment, then they have to have like a payoff, and they have to understand how their characters have grown or changed as a part of that. Because even in a 3-hour role-playing session, people want to feel like they've accomplished something. Otherwise, they just sat and ate dinner and rolled some dice. And like, maybe that's fine. But the idea of like, what was the payoff for it? That's what really matters.
I want to go back to something you said a bit earlier, where you talked about some toxic behaviors. Again, we're talking about, you're presenting a narrative where you don't always know how people might react because they may have certain experiences, past experiences. How do you maintain that inclusion without knowing how something is going to affect someone?
Yeah. So I would always have a chat about this ahead of time. And, especially during public play, right? Like I was actually caught off guard one time where I had a table that was like a thrown together mix of people. People at the table didn't even know each other. And one of the people at the table was a father and a daughter. And then there were 4 other people that were more experienced gamers. We came around to like talking about what people were wearing and what they were dressed like and stuff like that. There was one gentleman there that made some like pretty raunchy, inappropriate comments about the way his character was dressed. And one of the things I really loved about the way that we ran the collective is we had basically a zero tolerance policy for all that sort of stuff. We had a bunch of guys that ran restaurants that were the managers of the collective. And it was three gentlemen that all worked in bartending and the food industry. And so like, they didn't really put up with stuff like that. And they had a very clear mental model for how to address bad behavior and how to like get rid of it. And so it was definitely one of those situations where I was like, hey, person, come have a drink with me at the bar real quick. So I pulled the guy aside, went up to the bar, and I was like, hey, look, like you have a father-daughter that is sitting across from you, and the description that you used made them obviously uncomfortable. If you're going to continue down that road, we're going to have to ask you to leave. And like, I'm buying you a drink because I want to talk this out with you. I don't want to publicly humiliate you in front of this entire table full of people, but I need to know if this is going to go in the right direction or not. And in that case, he was fine. And like, everybody reined it in and we had a great time. But there's been other cases where it wasn't fine. I would have people that would steal from my tables, which is just atrocious behavior, in my opinion, like unbelievable. The things that we would do that would earn a lifetime ban, we were really serious about, and we were very loud about that stuff. And it made it so that bad behavior, it was like one of the most rewarding moments, I think, in like, public play gaming for me, is I had a group of women and non-binary people come up to me and say, this has replaced our weekly game, or our monthly game. They said they replaced their monthly game because here we finally found a place where we feel safe.
That's amazing. Going back a bit, you were playing with that group, you were DMing. Have you been DMing or playing D&D since? Or did you take any breaks?
Oh yeah, I mean, there was a lull for sure. I had that game that I played in college for about 3 years or so. And then, it was a break between then and when I was in my, mid to late 30s, like a 12-year break, maybe. It was interesting. What got me back into it, this guy, Anthony, that I still game with every week. He put a post on Facebook, and again, getting back to the value of social media, right? He put a post on Facebook that he said, hey, I'm running an event space. And I'd known Anthony for a while. One of my close friends and he were neighbors. And so, I'd known him for quite a while. He posted on Facebook that he was running an event space. He was thinking about doing a pop-up, and it was going to be a roast pig and 3 hours of D&D. And I was like, that sounds like so much fun. Like, Anthony's an incredible chef. He makes insane food. And so I was super excited to go to this. They were completely sold out. I was like, So I sent him a text and I was like, hey, next one of these, let me know. I'd like to come. He's like, you and about 50 other people. He's like, I get the feeling these are going to be pretty popular. And so I came to the second one as a player, and by the third one, I was DMing. And what was really, really incredible about that story is we sold out the next 40 or 50 of them. And we kept it going for years. And then COVID ultimately ended up breaking the pop-up. But we still game every week together, now going on, 7 years, maybe even 8.
And you mentioned you started with the Star Wars role-playing game. Whether you played it correctly or not doesn't really matter. You mentioned also Blades in the Dark. Have you tried any other systems, or has D&D been the main one always?
I mean, D&D has been the one we predominantly played, but there's so many that are great. We played Blades for over a year. Cyberpunk has been awesome as well. The new edition is pretty fantastic and a lot of fun for like a really gritty world. We also play a lot of Morkborg, which is a weird like Norwegian metal, black metal sort of end of the world apocalyptic style fantasy. We played the One Ring to do a little like Lord of the Rings fantasy playing. There's also some like obscure systems that we've dabbled around. Dancing with Bullets Under a Neon Sun is a hoot, especially for a low prep game. If you guys want to experience a walk on the wild side, Thirsty Sword Lesbians is a trip, and the artwork is insane. And so there's lots of stuff that we do, and like it's interesting, right? Because most of us are pretty fascinated by both the systems and the art that comes along with it. Anthony bought 50 years of D&D art, and just being able to go through that as like a coffee table read is also really incredible. So there's a lot of this with different systems. It's funny, I got actually like next to me is my entire wall of gaming books, and let's see what else is up there. Some Shadowrun, which is an awesome one. Yeah, I mean, there's too many to list, but there's a lot of different systems we've all played with.
What kept bringing you back to D&D?
And the community around is gigantic. And I think that there's something about it being like somewhat OG. You know, the system was devised a long time ago, and so it's had a lot of time to mature. And while there's downsides that come along with it, it's a pretty tight system. They've done a good job. And also it's nice because like at this point, you know, plugged in enough to the tabletop community that I got friends that write at Wizards and I like to support their work.
What's your favorite edition?
I mean, 5th is nice because it's a lot more streamlined and smooth. I mean, 3rd, like, you know, fighter with 2-weapon fighting and all the other stuff that they would get, you're rolling like 16 times in one turn at a high enough level. And so that gets messy and tedious, I would say. And so there are some beautiful things about 4th edition that I'm a little sad just never really got caught on. And then, I mean, we'll see what happens with next. Now is what it's called. Now. Wow, it's weird to say. But yeah, with now, like there's supposed to be a lot of streamlining things. Like, you know, there's still stuff that doesn't make sense, right? Like grappling is weird still. Mounted combat's weird still. There's all these like edge cases to things that are still somewhat problematic, but it's a pretty good addition. Where I kind of like came, I think, to it being my favorite, I got to play in a pretty special game table where Level Eater came to Portland, and the group, the collective, Orcs, got to participate in the Level Eater events. And I got to be at the VIP table with Perkins, who's one of the guys that wrote 5th edition. And I was still fairly new to the edition at the time. And wouldn't you know it, in the 3rd round of combat, Chris Perkins rolled a crit with the monster that I was fighting him on and killed me. And it's like it's kind of cool to spend a lot of time in D&D in your life and to have the creator of the edition of D&D that you're playing brutally and ultimately destroy your character at a game table. And it was funny because it was right at the start. And so he let me roll a new character. And what was really cool is he gave me the D20 he killed me with. So I still have that. And I use it to this day.
Nice. When you create your campaigns, where do you draw inspiration from?
It's pretty varied, honestly. You know, I really like to have intrigue in my campaigns. I think that like the more complicated a narrative you can weave, the more interesting it tends to become for players and the more options you have to explore. And so right now I'm running a campaign based in the city of Brass, which is like this, you know, plane of fire sort of, you know, mythical Agrabah from Aladdin, right? And I've always wanted to run one of these campaigns because I think it's because like I read Alibaba and the 40 Thieves when I was in like middle school or high school and loved it. And so, you know, I wanted to do this adventure that felt like this like faraway place with mysticism and intrigue that was at times very political. And so being able to draw on, again, some of the less savory parts of a system where you talk about like these horrible authoritarian Ifriti rulers of this city where like slavery is common and stuff like that. And then you figure out how you can be either a cog in that machine or fight against it. And so I don't shy away necessarily from difficult topics, but a lot of it is inspired on like real life political events or things that are actually happening in the world around us, because it draws a better connection to the story. And you try to do it in a way that still is fun, right? Like I'm not going to go talk about like Gaza and Palestine and Israel in a gaming session, because that's not going to be fun or inviting for people. But you can draw in themes about like oppression or about tragedy that represent like strictly human things that can work their way into a fantasy world to make a game more interesting.
Do you miss going back to being more of a player? Do you miss those surprises you get and going into a mystery, essentially?
Heck yeah. I would say that now in my tabletop career, if you could call it that, about 80+% of my time is DMing. It's running the adventure. And there are times when I get to be a player character that is just like, it's refreshing. And I recognize that I'm bad at it. I'm doing a bunch of the things that a bunch of like things I hate about my players. I end up doing those things. And it always makes me giggle a little bit on the inside. But, you know, in particular for some of those more obscure systems, that's when I really enjoy it. Like I always play this character that was modeled after the assassin with the guitar case in that movie Desperado. And I loved it. It was so much fun to have a character that's like a guitar playing, suitcase full of guns toting badass that would just walk around in this like bizarro world. That was really fun.
That's awesome. Chris, where can people find you?
It's probably easiest on LinkedIn these days. I spend a lot less time on Twitter now that I don't have like as much to do in the public gaming sphere. And so that's probably the best place. You can also always hit me up on, well, actually, I probably don't want to give out my email address. But no, you can hit me up on LinkedIn. That's probably the best way. You know, other ways to reach me is you can DM me on Twitter. Like I said, I'm not there as often as I used to be, but happy to go in and reply if you want to reach me.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Chris. It was fascinating.
Yeah, it's super fun. It was a great like trip down memory lane. Nobody's asked me about my first adventure, I think, ever. Like I was almost embarrassed to talk about it. Like I wrote that when I was 19. Ugh.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
This is all for this episode of Design Downtime. Thank you for joining me. And until next time, I hope you enjoy your downtime.